Greetings. This lecture is on employee separation. Specifically, how do we remove an employee from an organization? Sometimes it's voluntarily, we do this, sometimes it's involuntarily. And we talked about issues of turnover earlier on in the semester. So what we're going to get to now are the more challenging issues of when we have to make a decision to fire someone or to lay them off. How do we go about doing that? So, as you guys know from the first slide, there are a multitude of reasons why people leave an organization. Sometimes it's voluntary and sometimes it's involuntary. Sometimes they're fired or they're laid off, so it could be a variety of reasons. We also talked, when we talked about HR planning, that we don't always have to make a hire or we don't always have to fire somebody. Sometimes we can do layoffs, and even if we choose not to do a layoff, there are other alternatives that we can use. For example, we could do a hiring freeze, or we could do reduced work hours for everybody so that there's everybody takes an equal cut. We could transfer people, we could relocate them, we can demote them. These are all ways that we can find a way to decrease our labor supply without it hurting the company in the long haul. So we have to make some really hard decisions about how we want to handle that. A layoff is very different than a firing, where a layoff is a situation where we let someone go, but we have the option to rehire them later. And usually we lay somebody off because we're having economic problems or some other issues, but what we're really looking at is if they have been a good performer in the past and we like them, it gives us an opportunity to call them back. So sometimes we have to make a layoff decision that's not related to a disciplinary issue. Sometimes it's the company is selling off a division, or they decide to close a division down because the product just is too old and it's not selling anymore. So we can do a layoff, and we can try to create a situation where even though I don't need them now, if I had an opportunity, I would bring them back later. In terms of downsizing, it's a way that we can do a layoff, and with downsizing, our goal here is that we want to restructure and reorganize the business in such a way that we can be more effective and more efficient in the way that we do things. And so downsizing is really more about what we call right-sizing, where we come up with a strategy and we develop a structure based on that strategy, and that structure may rearrange the way that we do work, and it may shrink the size of our organization because we rearrange the way that we do work. So stock market reactions to downsizing are actually fairly positive. The initial reactions to downsizing or right-sizing is usually a very positive reaction. The stock market prices start to go up. But what starts to happen after a while is the company has to make a choice. They're either going to continue to survive, and they'll adapt and change given their strategic reason for downsizing, or they may downsize and then fail after that because they made bad decisions about why they were downsizing. So our goal is start with a good strategy. Does the strategy dictate that the company should be smaller and more efficient and more effective in the way that they do things? And when there's a strategic plan behind some of the problems that the company is facing, particularly in an economic downturn, and if there's a strategy behind it, then the stock market really likes that. And the stock market, not only will the stock prices rise, but they'll continue to rise for a while, and they'll stay at an elevated level because the company is showing that it has some forethought and some foresight about how to keep themselves fairly active. If, however, the company has no strategy behind their downsizing, they make a decision to lay people off because they figure, oh, we'll just cut expenses and that'll fix the problem, and they really don't have a strategic vision behind why they're doing this, the stock market doesn't like it, and ultimately, after an initial spike, the market starts to fade, and then the stock price starts to go down in a way that's not very productive. But so if you've got a good plan, if there's a good strategy behind it, if it makes economic sense and structural sense and sort of business practice and business plan sense, then that's what we end up doing. The market appreciates that, and the market will go up. If we're simply reacting like Chicken Little and we're just cutting expenses and cutting off arms and legs without having any real rhyme or reason to it, the stock market sniffs that out fairly quickly, and will have a negative reaction in the long haul. Why do organizations downsize? Well, number one, to reduce costs. Number two, to decrease bureaucracy. Number three, to increase productivity. And number four, to increase performance overall. Now, the first one, reducing costs, makes perfect sense, right? If you have less people in the company, it's going to cost you less money, although there are some fixed overhead costs. It does decrease bureaucracy. We have less layers to deal with. We have a more flatter, more flexible organization, and so the bureaucracy, the red tape they have to go through to get things approved is minimal. It does increase productivity, but that's just a mathematical formula if you think about it. If we're looking at the number of widgets I make per day, if I want to increase my productivity for my workforce, and I want each individual employee to do more, if I have a set workforce of 100 people and they each make 20 widgets a day, then we're talking about 2,000 widgets a day all those employees make. If I cut my employees back and I no longer have 100 employees, and now what I have is something more to the tune of 80 employees. Each employee has to produce more in order to keep the same level of productivity for the organization. So simply by cutting the number of people you have and forcing them to work the overtime, to work the longer hours, to meet the same demands, you are by definition going to get greater productivity. That doesn't mean it's healthy productivity. It doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. But that's what we end up seeing. In terms of overall performance and profitability, again, if we're decreasing expenses, by definition, profitability increases. So when we're downsizing, there's a number of different approaches we can take to layoffs. The first one is, I call it the LIFO method, last in, first out. And this is usually based on seniority. And we've talked about this, that unions really like a seniority-based system. It's very legally defensible. There's a lot of support for it because the unions see it as a very quantifiable way to understand who's got seniority and who doesn't. The downside is, of course, if you've got some really good employees who are the newly hired and they have a lot of potential to help us in areas where we haven't been working well before, because we have this bona fide seniority system, those are the people who are the first to go, even if they may contribute more to the company than somebody more senior. It's not always the case, but there may be circumstances where an employee may be less tenure or less senior, but may actually contribute quite a bit to the company. The other problem that we may have is regarding affirmative action plans. Usually the last people hired are more diverse because diversity efforts are more recent in time than longitudinal. So because we're more involved recently with hiring people to be more diverse, we also recognize that we are in a tough situation where we may be losing some of our more diverse employees regardless of how well or not so well they perform. So we lose the diversity of our company by definition. Another approach to layoff is seniority based, but it's based on early retirement. And what we're doing with early retirement is we're encouraging our older, more expensive employees to retire early. We're not requiring them, we're asking them. We're making it incredibly attractive for them to do that by offering them some, reasonable severance packages, putting more money in their retirement plans, but anyway, to encourage people to retire earlier. There are great advantages to this in that we're getting rid of some of our more higher wage employees, that we have longer term savings. There's a lot of promotional opportunities when we get rid of top management and people sort of move up in the ranks. And employees can decide whether or not they want to get laid off. I mean, they can decide whether or not they want to early retire. If they want to early retire, then it works out great. If they don't, then they can stay on, and the company benefits from that. The downside, of course, is there's a loss of skills, a lot of high upfront costs. Also, because you have to pay people out to get out of their contracts, or to encourage them. The incentive you give them to leave is usually a couple months' wages. So your expenses are really high up front, although you may have some longer term savings. But you do lose an enormous amount of skills, and you may in the end have to hire these people back. The last way we could approach this is through skill and productivity, where we keep our best performers. This feels like a reward to people. It really resonates with folks. The downside, of course, is if you have a really lousy performance appraisal system, how do you know who the best worker is? And if you don't have a good performance appraisal system, you may have documentation that's just not going to hold up in the court of law. So moving on to the next slide, where we talk about the rights that are affecting the employment relationship. I've mentioned employment at will. We'll talk a little bit more detail about that. Wrongful and constructive discharge, where we're illegally firing somebody. Where just cause, where we fire someone for a good reason. Due process, where we give people an opportunity to defend themselves, or to gather information, be able to mount a response to accusatory challenges. And then, of course, we're always considering distributive and procedural justice, making sure that the outcome is fair, that the process is fair, and all these things contribute to a better employment relationship. So, employment at will is where we can fire people for just cause or no cause at all. Employees also have that same right. So you can be let go of a company, or you can quit. Either way, it's the same effect. And if you're at will, you're not under any major obligation to stay with the company if you don't want to. Employment at will has some limitations. Number one, you cannot have it violate public policy or public laws. So you can't say, well, I only want to hire women for this job, or I only want to hire men for this job, because that's illegal to do. The other exceptions to the employment at will is if you have either an implied or existing contract that basically sets up the terms of your employment. So you know when you're going to start, when you're going to end, how long the contract is, what you'll be compensated, whether or not you'll be able to have a severance package when you get laid off, etc. Employment contracts, like through unions, are also exceptions to employment at will. In terms of other aspects, if you don't treat people with fairness in mind, for example, firing somebody or laying someone off as they return from maternity leave, or someone who's out sick, just saying, well, you're going to be too sick, so we're just going to let you go. A lot of these are ways that we can manage employment at will. There are, of course, restrictions. Wrongful discharge is when we are using illegal or improper reasons for terminating someone's employment. Usually it's some sort of gross misconduct. If they misbehave and they do something illegal or inappropriate, we can fire them for those reasons. Constructive discharge is much more commonly found, but also very difficult to prove, where an employer deliberately says the working conditions are intolerable for the employee, and they make it so difficult for them to live there that they finally just say, okay, I quit. I can't deal with this anymore. You're making it much too difficult for me. So constructive discharge doesn't mean that the company has to actually fire someone, but if they harass that person so much, it is, for all intents and purposes, a form of a firing or a discharge. How do we prepare a defense against wrongful discharge? Number one, we have to make sure we have a really good, solid performance appraisal system. Then we have to make sure that we've maintained good, well-documented records about our employees, about our interactions with them. We should always get in the habit of writing that stuff down, and kind of go from there. Also under employment at will are things like just cause or due process. These are all based on issues of what we consider to be fair or a level playing field. And so employment at will is based on the fact that even though the employee can pick up and go at any time, the employer can do the same thing. It's only when it's taken to the extremes that it's much more of a problem. There are some termination limitations under at will. So you're protected as a whistleblower. You're protected if you want to complain about working conditions. You're protected if you're engaging in nonviolent lawful activities. You are also protected for filing a workers' comp claim. That may be a concern downstream if they realize you're creating fraud, but for the most part, filing a workers' comp claim is not evidence that you should be fired at will. Other things that you can do that are limitations to at will is, you may not be fired for filing discrimination charges with the EEOC and things like that. What can you get fired for? If you keep working really hard and nothing seems to work out, you can be let go. Doesn't mean you can't get workers' comp, because that's always possible, but for the most part, we recognize that it wasn't a really good person-job match. You can be let go because of gross or repeated insubordination. You could also be let go because of civil rights violations, if you're violating the law and you're discriminating based on race, sex, ethnic origin, etc. You cannot physically or verbally abuse anybody. Do not falsify records, and also be careful of drug and alcohol abuse on the job. While a recovering alcoholic is covered under ADA, an existing alcoholic and drug abuser is not.